from the Local Development Research Institute here in Nairobi, Kenya. On behalf of the Data for Development Network, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the people joining us today. This roundtable session will be looking at the state of open data in the Southeast and Southeast Asia region. Since our first publication in 2019, we've had significant developments, and our esteemed panel with us today will be sharing the current state of open data in this region. And our session chair for today will be Miko. Miko Cañares is founder and strategy advisor at Step Up Consulting in the Philippines. He has extensive experience leading research and capacity development initiatives on open data, data for development, and open government across Southeast Asia. Over to you, Miko.
Thanks very much, Amina, and thanks very much for the early people here, the people here who have just joined. I think we have registered 45 participants or so, but I hope they're coming in a little bit. It's a pleasure to be hosting this discussion today. Looks like a reunion of some sort. I can see Hilani and Isad and also Joel. Everyone is here. Thank you very much for joining this discussion, and I am pleased to host this session together with the Data for Development Network, the Local Development Research Institute, and IDRC. And at the same time, also very pleased to be joined by three of my old friends working on open data in the region. We have Phet, Sayo, is the Executive Director of EngageMedia, who brings decades of experience in information communications and technology for development, as well as internet governance. Prior to joining EngageMedia, Phet has served for 15 years as a senior program officer at the International Development Research Center, a role where I've met Phet for the first time, actually, many years ago. Pyrou, who is from the East-West Management Institute as Open Development Initiative, has extensive experience in the development sector, in the conservation and human rights, including extensive work as what I mentioned, Open Development Initiative in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, and Myanmar. Pyrou is an ecologist and sustainable development practitioner and has worked between the nexus of environmental governance, conservation, and human rights. I've known also Pyrou for many years as well. And thanks, Pyrou, for joining this panel. Phet, by the way, is based in Pak Se in Laos, while Pyrou is based currently in Chiang Mai in Thailand, while I am also based in Bangkok. We also have somebody based from the Philippines, Ivy Ong, who joined the Open Government Partnership in February 2018, and is currently the acting regional lead for the Asia Pacific at OGP. She leads delivery and team management for the OGP support unit's programmatic work in Asia and the Pacific. And she provides guidance and assistance to governments, civil society organizations, and other key actors across supporting the development and implementation of open government reforms. So thanks very much, everyone. And before anything else, because let me just very quickly go into let me just share my screen, and also at the same time, let me just check if you're able to see my screen this time. Ivy, are you? No?
Yes.
Okay.
You can see it's click to exit full screen. That's what it's showing.
What is happening here?
But Mentimeter,
Okay.
yeah, there you go. There you go.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Ivy. Okay. So very quickly, I would just like to ask a few questions. Welcome. And a few questions to start with. We'll be using menti.com over the course of the session. So if you can just please log on to menti.com in your phone or in your computer and enter the code 19615140, or you can use the QR code out there for that. I can see the 3 people are already inside now, Menti. So let's see. We have 3. Just let's wait for the others to join in before I do the next question. We're 4 still. Let me check if the others are able to come in as well. Okay, we're 5 now. So again, just log on to menti.com and enter the code 19615140. Okay, maybe the others will be joining in a bit. And let's just start with the first question. I think I would just like to ask you the first one. Which country are you currently residing? So we have Malaysia already, Canada, Philippines, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam. We have somebody from Zimbabwe. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think we have a lot of somebody from the UK. We have a few. We have a lot of people. Maybe it's you and me, Pyrou, coming from Thailand. Okay, great. That's great. So this is quite a representation. Thanks very much. Okay, let's go to the next question. What type of organization are you working for right now? So we already have 1 from government, 3 from non-governmental organization. We have 7. We have a private sector and others. So currently we have 1 from government, 1 from the private sector, 1 from academia or a university or an academic institution. And then we have 8 from non-governmental organization, hail NGOs, 0 from the media and 1 for others. I'm not just sure what others would mean, but let's move ahead. Okay, so what do we want to do today? We would like to start off with a presentation on the state of open data in Southeast and Southeast Asia. I will do a very quick presentation on that one. And then we'll do a panel discussion on the state of things. But before we do a panel discussion, we will do a conversation with the audience first using Menti, and I would really hope that you will be able to participate meaningfully in the survey. And then the next panel discussion will be about what to do with the current state that we're in. And finally, Q&A with the panelists at the end, towards the end of our session. Okay, I would start off by saying that I wrote the open data chapter, the East, South, and Southeast Asia chapter in the State of Open Data report in 2019, and we did an update of that one in the current edition, which is now 2022, and these are the key findings that we have. So I would just like to breeze through these findings before we do a panel discussion. So sometime in 2015, there was a group of people convened with support from IDRC in Indonesia, and I think that was February of 2015, where we tried to look at what would be the vision of open data in Asia in 2020. 2020 has already passed, but these are the things that that initial group would like to see. They would like to see more open governments, stronger multi-sectoral collaborations on open data, and empowered citizens who use and benefit from open data. So that was the vision back then. Now, the question would be, we are now at 2023, where are we in those areas? So when we look at the Open Data Barometer results on the state of open data that I did in 2019, there were, I think, 4 major findings there. Data initiatives, for example, were focused on supply-side interventions because it was a start of the time where, governments are actually asked by way of advocacy or by way of international agreements to put more data into the public domain. And that's why a lot of those interventions are actually supply-side focused. The second finding of that chapter was that open data initiatives focus on central governments largely, except for a few countries. One noteworthy example with this would be in China, wherein you don't really necessarily have an open data initiative at the national level, but you have a lot of sprouting local government initiatives on open data done, for example, like the Shanghai Open Data Assembly but that was done by national government non-government organizations. Back then, data quality and availability was a problem. There was data dumping in some cases. In some cases, you don't have available data. For example, in a lot of countries in the region, you have budget data is actually disclosed publicly, sometimes in non-open formats, but if you talk about spending data, it's not actually there. Finally, data reuse during that time was concentrated on more affluent countries, and leading the pack here would be South Korea, for example, and also there's a lot of things that has been going on in the case, for example, of India. There was with IndiSAP during that time, and also, but less and less on less affluent economies. In the Global Data Barometer Hub Perspectives that was published by the GDB last year with Khairul Yusuf and Pyrou Chung writing, they were actually saying that overall GDP scores correlate with level of economic development, which is actually something which is related to what has been found out in the 2019 edition. Second is that data capacities do not necessarily translate to impact, meaning to say, for example, if you have countries that have high data capacities, it's not actually translated into impact. Why? Because there's a large gap between data availability and reuse. Sometimes data is not available, and others, data is available, but reuse is actually scant. So in a way, I mean, what we're saying is that not much has changed. Things remain pretty much the same. You have progress here and there at some point, but not on a general scheme of things, you can actually see somehow that there's not much of any difference with the situations in terms of a 4-year scenario. So why are we saying that has been changed? A lot has, I mean, despite several initiatives, not much has changed. Because first, we've seen that the right to data and information remain unprotected. So in a lot of countries, for example, I mean, countries like the Philippines doesn't have a right to information law, for example. And in others, there's nothing, I mean, in all countries, for example, the right to data is not even enshrined anywhere in legal instruments. And we know for a fact that if the right to information, for example, is not actually there, then there's a significant impact on the ability of citizens, for example, to demand information, to actually demand accountability from government. At the same time, also to be able to analyze what government is practically doing in all sorts of things, like from contracting to budgeting to project implementations to use of resources and so on. The other thing that we're seeing is that data availability and quality remain a problem. For example, as we've mentioned, spending data is not yet there still up to now. I mean, climate change has been impacting the region significantly, but there's very little information on climate data. There was, I mean, in the space where I'm working on, for example, now, transboundary water flows in the Mekong sub-region, for example, which has impact on livelihoods across different countries, 4 countries, or 5 or 4 countries, as a matter of fact, in the downstream area of the Mekong. You don't actually see data on this area on water availability, which actually has a large of impact on how, for example, upstream dams are actually impacting livelihoods downstream. So if there is data, quality remains to be a problem. There are still areas across different governments wherein data is not actually published in open formats. They're still in PDFs, much worse, they're still in PDFs converted from picture formats. So when we are looking at the results of the Global Data Barometer, for example, we can see that there's limited open data use and impact except for wealthy nations. You can see, for example, here that very little impact can be seen in a lot of countries across the region. So that's very brief, but again, I would like to invite you to go to menti.com and at least answer with me 2 specific questions. The first question that I would like to ask you for now is, what do you think is the biggest win for open data in the region in the last 3 years? So that's the first question. And I'll ask you again the question which is negative to that one, which is, what do you think is the biggest challenge hindering progress on open data across countries in the region? So I would like again to invite you to go to Menti. Again, the same login as the last time. So we have seen, for example, that we'll the same login procedures as last time. You just go to menti.com. You can see that on the screen and use this code 19615140. Okay, we have a few answers now, so I'll show the answers. Sorry. We have a few answers now, so let's take a look at the answers. People are talking about data and a necessity for change. That's one. Somebody was saying unsure. Greater awareness on the part of people regarding value of open data. There's also pandemic forces digitalization in government, so there is more data available. There's one on alongside data.gov that in India, we see the site or other sites like Justice Hub and Tatlo and Civic Tech also. Very nice. Non-binary progress, steps moving closer to increase capacity or data availability, including by CSOs, which I also have seen, I think, across different countries in the region that we're looking at. Not familiar with the region enough to give one, but encouraged that people are still talking about it. Nice. Then we have the government has begun to take the initial steps of implementing open data portals and has taken action for the introduction of drafts of open data catalogs. Oh, this is really good. So at one end, you see, for example, that there are a lot of supply side interventions that are happening, either like, for example, the pandemic absolutely forces digitalization and government, making data more available. At the same time, we can also see that a lot of replications of open data initiatives have sprouted elsewhere, and also there's a lot of things related to building of capacity and greater awareness on the part of people regarding the value of open data. That's nice. Can we take a look at the next question this time? Our next question is that, what do you think is the biggest challenge hindering progress on open data across countries in the region? And for now, we have two answers. The first one is the veracity of the data from the Indian government. Yeah, I've seen an article that was actually written by a good friend of mine that looks at the volume and amount of data and also the challenges related to standardization. Lack of open data mandates, incentive systems that we need to understand. They need to understand between open data and positive outcomes. Yeah, so potentially there's not that one is not yet clear regarding what's the actually what's actually the impact of, you know, I mean, like opening data sets. We've seen, for example, that in the previous slide, somebody talked about pandemic and digitization. But we've also seen in a lot of studies wherein the pandemic has actually pushed for more information control on the part of government and the unwillingness to actually to share data because they don't want, because on the pretext that, for example, fake news is actually impacting the veracity of information. There's capacity coordination of efforts across agencies, data privacy. There's weak political authority to drive openness coupled with shrinking civic space. Yeah, we have seen, for example, I think, yeah, we've seen this, for example, in the Freedom House Index, when there's actually a lot of countries in the region with data not data rather, but with the liberty and freedom of people is actually significantly constrained in the last couple of years. Then we have political will of political leaders to streamline government agencies involved and inclusiveness of marginalized communities. We also have data commodification has perpetuated existing culture of hierarchical power and secrecy. We're always there, and releasing data doesn't change this. This is a very thoughtful provocation, and I think we should go back to this in a little bit. Do we have more answers? We don't have more answers in this one. And let's see, we have more answers here. Okay, we're just on time, and we can go back to these answers in a little bit, but I would like to stop sharing now. I would like to invite our panelists to join us in this discussion. And if I could invite, who would like to go ahead? Pyrou, Ivy, Phet, I think you're muting your microphone, unmuting yourself. So I think I'll start off with you.
Maybe I shouldn't have. Thanks, Michael. First of all, thanks for inviting me to this discussion. In my new current hat, I was trying to figure out how our organization currently intersects with open data, but I was digging back to old notes, and I'm glad you covered the 2015 workshop, because I was going through my old photos, and there you are, there's Ivy, there's me, and there's a number of people, and that was the inception of the Open Data Barometer that's now the global data barometer. It's great to see that IDRC is keeping support of the movement. So my sort of thinking, I actually will kind of wear both hats. My former life now, it's almost 10 years, right, since that 2015 workshop. And I'm thinking it from the perspective of, and I'm just now providing commentary, sorry, Michael, but I'm just gonna provide a little bit of commentary, because I think it's important to think about movement building in the context and the investments for it, because that 2015 workshop was key on a number of things. I mentioned the barometer, but it was also investment to the Open Data Lab in Jakarta. What remains isn't the lab, because the lab is no longer in existence. So the institution building in this instance, I'm not going to say it was a failure or anything, because what remains is the number of people here that's still part of the movement. Yourself, myself, Ivy, and I've been thinking of a number of other people that was in that room, and I don't think I have their permission to name them, but that investment seems to have lasted, and the barometer as a tool has seemed to have lasted too. So it's interesting to think about when you're saying wins. I was one of the people who couldn't really answer, because I had a hiatus between that previous life and my current job, but I was thinking about the long-term movement building. And so that was just, if I can just comment and give a bit of context about that. And any response I have forward, it will be in that context of long-term movement building. That's my initial reaction. First point. And the other point I wanted to react to is the data commodification point that someone made there, because I sort of thinking about what would I say to this panel here about ways forward. So maybe I'm jumping the gun, but in the context of movement building, it seems like initially at 2015, we were talking about availability of data and such, And now I think the next level of movement building is towards data justice. And this question of power, class analysis, intersectionality, etc., which makes the task even harder, because we're already struggling with the open data is the niche within the ecosystem of data governance, but now added on to the responsibility of not only getting in the mechanisms in place for opening data, but now the thinking of the whole chain of responsible, non-biased, ethical data and all that. That seems like, and I'll stop there. Those are my two reflections of thinking, wow, it's almost been 10 years since some seeds have been laid, and what remains, I think, is still the movement is going on strong, obviously evidenced by us being here and having this conversation. So I'll pause there. That's just as an opener, these are my comments. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks very much, Phet, and very insightful indeed. One thing is that, there are two important things that you mentioned there. The first one is about the movement building stuff. And I think what you're actually trying to allude now to, Phet, is that the movement building stuff should actually go beyond data availability and data quality and move towards data justice and look into power dynamics that are actually impacting on the way data is actually made available and data is actually used, which, by the way, is something that Pyrou is actually working on more significantly in the last couple of years, Pyrou. So yes. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so we were in existence in 2015, but I don't think we were part of that movement at the time. But back in the day, we were trying to catalyze the Open Development Initiative and the Mekong platform specifically around social justice issues. And so the basis and the fundamental spark or catalyst for that was that activists, land rights activists, environmental activists, human rights activists needed evidence to put forth cases and predominantly to litigate, right? To attain justice through courts or through other mechanisms. And so we started the movement and we never used the term open data. So when we actually joined the platform, even though the platform is called the Open Development Mekong and the initiative, we actually never really used the term open data, and we actually had to learn what open data was. And that I think was really it was a catalyst for us to look at standards, to look at modalities of best practices. And now we're in 2023, losing track of the years. And our movement has changed. So we established the platforms now run, and they are one of the leading civil society platforms that is used to attain data and information, because we have teams across the Mekong region that are accessing government data and republishing it. So we facilitate this niche gap in where data is often made available, but it doesn't actually measure on scales like the barometer because it's not released by governments, right? So it depends on the metrics that you actually assess what is open there. And so there's a ton of data available within the region that civil society is proactively releasing. The problem is much of that data about those people don't actually relate to those people. Much of that data was attained without consent, without prior knowledge, and it's utilized in ways and in narratives that actually oppress them. And so this increase in data, especially during the COVID times, we saw a lot of increased existing oppressions through digitization of data towards marginalized communities, Indigenous communities, and other migrants and vulnerable communities. And so I think there is a need to re-articulate what we mean by opening up data and for whose benefit. So the programs that we run now go beyond the platform. So we're working with civil society groups to look at data sovereignty. And so I think what we mean here is not just data justice, and roles and responsibilities, but actually rights for governance. We're looking at access and control, which actually is invested in language. So access not just to technologies, but infrastructure and technologies in a way that is fit for purpose and accessible to them in the language of their choice. We're looking for also justice and jurisdictional justice. So looking at recourse availability. So not only do they need to provide consent or have control over that consent and retract that, they need to have modalities and mechanisms within governing structures to have recourse. And I think this is really enshrined in the Indigenous data sovereign movement that we're generating across Asia. We now have a regional framework that we're piloting across the region with Indigenous communities. And we hope that it sets down a baseline, a best practice baseline on to how to think more ethically and responsibly about empowering communities to take control of that data, assess, analyze, and utilize it for their benefit, and spit that out to governments to say, this is your truth, this is our truth. How can we find a way within these data and these data sets or information that we share to actually build more collaborative development strategies, to build more collaborative modalities for economic development that is vested in not only communities' growth, but the nation, right? And so I think it's a flip idea on how do we create that ecosystem that allows for that to happen.
Thanks very much, Pyrou. And before I go to Ivy, just very quick question on political context and climate, or the space to actually interact with government. In a lot of jurisdictions that you're working in, there's somehow a lot of restrictions as well on how civil society organizations are actually interacting with government on data. How do you see that changing over the last couple of years, for example? I mean, has it changed for the better or for the worse?
You're addressing Mr. Phet or myself?
To you this time.
To me, yes. So I actually think, so the updated report really, I mean, there's a great parallel between civic democracies and openness of data, right? There's a strict parallel, and we've seen civic space decline, and that has paralleled with the shrinking space of data and information. So we know that that's parallel. But in the spaces where I'm working with environmental activists and NGOs, conservation groups in this space, the one thing that has changed is that governments are more open to talking about data. You know, there are regional conferences that are held. The MRC just had their summit. You know, data was, you know, a high priority during that summit, which was hosted in Vientiane recently. But the problem is the way that they articulating and using data, it's actually being weaponized on a certain level politically. And so you'll have representatives, political representatives, stand up and say, we don't have enough data. We need the evidence. But who holds that data, and who has that evidence, and who has access to that? Who created it? Where did it come from? All of these things are still controlled by central power and political elites. And so that dynamic is just being reinforced now with data. And so then data then becomes the sort of, how do you say, it's just like this mechanism to say, okay, we listen to you because we have this data, but there's no accountability. There's still no transparency around that data. And so even though these conversations are happening, I think we really need to reflect upon the narratives that are being driven underneath when these conversations are happening.
Thanks, Pyrou. And I think that's a good segue for Ivy this time on. I know that the Open Government Partnership has been working very much, or very hard actually, on exacting commitments to ensure transparency, accountability, and governance across its member countries. How has it been in the last 3 years, Ivy? I mean, how do we see, for example, Peru has mentioned that there's a lot of significant progress already on how governments are talking about data. From your vantage point, what has changed and what can you consider as probably big gains or challenges as well?
Right. No, so I had something prepared and then I was listening to Phet and Pyrou. I was like, okay, wait, I need to kind of shift it a bit because it's also quite enriching in that some of these points that you raised kind of link with what the research has shown for the past 12 years for OGP. The sad thing here is if you just do an analysis of how many commitments there are around open data and around right to information, ever since OGP started, there was just a boom of open data. But then from 2020 up until now, it has just gone down, has started going down. And then right to information, as mentioned by Pyrou, when the pandemic happened, citizen surveillance, right? Using data for surveillance also started coming up as issues. But I guess going to the point, the question of Miko, several things have come up that are aligned with what you said in the report. The challenges with data availability, the challenges around data quality, are all linked also with the number of government reformers that you have who are also working closely with civil society. So having that strong national and local level, for example, working together, mainstreaming open government across, that has been a challenge that we've been working on the past few years. And that's also the reason why the new strategy, very explicitly, the specific thing that we mentioned was we need to integrate the way we go about open government when we come together and bring together national and local government, private sector, civil society, parliament. So bringing everyone together in a coalition, a political coalition, to enable that political authorizing environment, if you will. Because now I've also noticed that we haven't really been using the language open data the past 3 years. When we talk about transparency, it's very specific to certain thematic areas. So if we want any kind of movement, the entry point isn't, the value proposition has shifted significantly in that even here in Asia Pacific, I've noticed activists have smartly changed gears with their approaches to certain ministries and have started using certain anchors. So for example, Indonesia, the anchor is around economy. The anchor is around energy transition. The anchor is around legal aid. And then you start embedding some of the values. So really being strategic and politically astute, I've noticed, has something, I think that has affected also the way how many times open data comes up in conversations, because it's not front and center anymore. It's kind of like a ninja that's behind what you want to do. So I'll stop there first because I think I won't jump the gun on the next section. Phet wants to go in.
Phet, go ahead, Phet.
I just wanted to say it's a sigh of relief because when I was preparing for this talk, it was like the first point I made to myself was like, do I even say this? Is sort of like the open data, the cachet of the open for the open data movement versus data for good or public good is sort of rebranding. I mean, let's say it, from the 2015 movement, it moved from that to the open data barometer became the global data barometer.
Phet, you're muted.
You're muted.
Maybe Fiona has accidentally.
Oh no! I said quite a bit, but let me just sort of sum up because I was saying that preparing for this, I'm hearing Ivy and I'm hearing Pyrou, what you're saying is a relief for me, because the first note I made for myself was sort of challenging the open data movement, whether or not the open part is still a value proposition for discussion. Of course, the ethos is there, and of course the point and the spirit is there, but is that the point of entry? And it doesn't seem to be, because I think even the international development investment has shifted. That you see the data for development. IDRC itself has changed. The D for D is with that open part. We know that within the greater ecosystem of data governance issues, it's super valuable, and we need to push that movement. However, how do we face that, push that agenda in the light of just data culture in general, and civic tech trying to move in a space, especially next generation civic tech, trying to, they're not necessarily sewn on the whole open development paradigm that we were kind of helping to support necessarily. So I was just saying that I was thinking to myself, is that point even valuable to make here? It doesn't take away from what we want to do, right? In terms of where we want to push transparency and all these weird outcomes. But from a perspective of movement building, is that moniker still a cachet for us? And I think the development sector is already saying that isn't the case. And I think evidence on the ground is saying that isn't the case, because the comments that people are giving around the pandemic, and the reason we're talking about closing of civic spaces, it's the other part of the open ecosystem where if we talk about open data as isolation that way, then we risk not addressing these. Okay. I'll stop then. I don't know who told me to do that, but I'll stop. But that's the point I wanted to make.
Their name, yeah.
Somebody has renamed himself Ivy Ong, and actually personally attacked. Okay, that's really, really bad.
Well, this is the cost of open. We're having an open discussion, and this is sort of coming in. And in a way, this speaks to what we're talking about, right? That we can't talk about the open in isolation. We're writing on infrastructure, the complexity of the whole spectrum of delivery, and all that. I think the political economy of our own discourse has changed. I think that's worth noting. And that's why you're saying that the matrix hasn't really changed, but I think major things have changed. And I think the point about the pandemic is that we have to give ourselves a pass in terms of whatever trajectory we thought we were going to meet. The pandemic represented something entirely different. And that's why we're talking about these others. But I'll stop right now, as the other person told me to shut the F up. I think it's the indicator. So I'll take the indicator.
He already left, actually. He already left. He just wanted to say that. Anyway, Pyrou, go.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up the other comments from the mentee was about security and security risks that were mentioned in relation to surveillance, which a lot of people mentioned. And I think one of the things, having worked specifically in these thematic sectors more prominently, is that these security issues already existed. They were already here. What is worse is that now they're transitioned to online spaces, and communities, and especially those who have less access or literacy in technology and generally, are vulnerable because they don't know how to protect themselves in these spaces. And so you have this parallel where technology is really beneficial to communities, especially rural communities. And you have all these statistics about how it's transforming the economy across Asia. But at the same time, it actually has had a really serious negative effect. We've seen the persecution of activists across the region through surveillance and other digitizations of their data that has caused a real regression in freedoms. And I think we didn't anticipate that this would be a huge consequence of, the proliferation of social media and other technologies in the region. But all I'm saying is that they existed before, they've just been amplified. And I think we have to recognize that progression towards openness and transparency isn't necessarily beneficial to everybody, and that there are vested interests within communities that don't benefit from having everything about their lands, their culture, their people published openly. And we need to reflect and respect that space and actually take stock and say, okay, what are the alternative ecosystems that are necessary here to be able to create and generate these safer spaces for these activists to progress their movements, right? And using data and technology. And I think this is what we're hopefully trying to do, but I think it's a heavily underinvested sector, because we focus so much on releasing publicly available data and utilizing existing technologies, which also is perpetuated and driven by donor funding in many cases. And so I think there's an element here of how do we break these cycles of traditional development models to actually create something new and actually innovate that is fit for purpose for communities.
Thanks very much, Pyrou. I'd probably have, I would probably like to invite a member of our audience to say something, their thoughts as well, before we go to the next round. Can I invite Hilani, for example, to say something? Hilani, would you be able to? Just like to know. I mean, I'm sorry for putting you on the spot there, but if you'd like to say something as well, that would be really nice. Okay. Oh, go ahead, Hilani.
Guys, very much on the spot, as I was making myself a tea. But I actually found this quite interesting that you see the change. Let me sort of be the skeptic and say we hear a lot of sort of this movement, and I'm still struggling to see sort of concrete impact, right? Because in South Asia, certainly, what I see is increasingly closed space for openness, right? I mean, for example, there's RTI laws, which are routinely rejected. I mean, RTI requests, what am I saying? That are routinely rejected. Oh, it's national security, it's something like that, right? So I think, we need to look at the existence of enabling laws. I think that's great, but also really look at the success rate of these and the number of times, it's used and rejected, for example. And I've always struggled to understand, Pyrou, and this is maybe a sort of I'm coming back at you with a genuine question, sort of what does it mean, traditional development models, and how we define this? Like, what do you say, we can learn, but what is it? Like, is there something concrete we should be doing? Because for a lot of us, I mean, there's, it sounds like words, but I'm looking for something concrete that we can hang on to, because we are in the development space and we are talking, and perhaps we are engaged or sort of anchored on very Western models of development, given it's sort of a capitalist economy. So what does the traditional indigenous model mean when you use those terms in terms of data? What does that really mean? And how do we scale up? Because to me, the problem of sort of small communities is how do we then make those values pertinent in a much larger group of people, like at a nation state level? I don't understand that. So which is why I'm here to learn, actually. So I'd like to touch on that. Thanks.
Yeah, so we just did a study looking at data gaps with civil society, actually, and it was a focus specifically on environmental data and environmental data sets. So if I can give an example, we were at this regional meeting recently around water, and it was I won't mention the donor. It was a big conference around water, and the whole entire focus of the conference was data. And there was a huge investment in looking at, how can we make data available and useful for decision making around water governance issues, blah, blah, blah. The predominant discussion within the presentations and the models that were used for data was completely foreign to the majority of the audience. So the data sets that we use, big data sets, spatial analysis, statistics data around population census, all of these data sets are so external to communities. They have no meaning. And you literally during this event had communities, Indigenous communities stand up and say, we don't understand what you're talking about. You're talking about our lands and territories in ways and modalities that have no meaning to us. And so the conversations goes on, and then the realization kind of hits home to say, okay, so now we just need to translate this data to make it accessible to these people, right? And so it's a problem of translation or literacy. But communities were standing up and saying, we've seen our fish stocks decline, water, crops, natural disasters, blah, blah, blah. This change has happened. We know this is happening. And you're telling us using these models, external models that have no meaning or connection, but you're not actually listening to us. So we're standing around with this very top-down approach to say, we have all of the information and we just need you guys to understand it. Whereas we're not saying, hang on a minute, you have knowledge and authority. How can we collaborate to say, this is what data and information you have here, and we need to feed that in to what we're doing, and you guys need to have a place at designing and developing that data. At that space equally to say, okay, yes, I can run an algorithm to look at breeding stock levels across a river and assess habitat quality and design that quantitatively in GIS systems, but communities are already saying that. And what we're saying to them is that you don't have the data. We have the data. We are the knowledge people. We are the authority persons. We're not creating the space to say, actually, you have data, you have information, you need to be at this table with us. So it's very much shoved down their throats. And so the model that we're trying to create is empowering communities to assert the data that they have. It's really hard to do. Building, governing communities, bringing communities together to design and build governing structures around how they manage their collectivized knowledge is really hard to do. We have a framework for this and we are working with communities to do this. But traditionally communities, especially Indigenous communities, they don't document things. So documentation is an issue. We only, in research, traditional Western-centric research, we only think something is authoritative if we can document it. And then we get other people in our circle to verify it, right? There's a lack of trust there. And that trust is never going to be built by people saying that you don't understand data.
I know
being told.
I know this will be a long discussion, and
Yes.
and I think this will be a subject of future conversations. But I think Sawalak actually has indicated in the chat the research that has been done by ODI on this one, which is on
Yes.
the research data gaps, which you mentioned a while ago.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we'll have to move on to the next. I hope Hilani and Pyrou, you will continue this conversation. I know, Pyrou, that you're starting off these data sovereignty discussions, and it would be a good thing to revisit moving forward, actually. So thanks very much, Hilani, for the question, and thanks, Pyrou, for that, and also for Hilani is saying, so Pyrou's challenge is about process. I totally agree that the process needs to be inclusive. I'm into that as well. Okay, very quickly, I would like us to move into, if you don't mind, one more time for a mentee discussion, because we don't have the time to go through each people and go around and ask them the question. So we will rely on mentee this time. And if you'd like, if you can, if you're the time now, go ahead to, let me just show my screen. Where's my screen? Let me just share my screen so that we can take a look at the last question that we'd like to have to reflect on for everyone today. So the question is, what do you think should be done to strengthen openness or open data practices in the region? And if possible, address it to a particular stakeholder. For example, if it's like to have a recommendation to governments or to advocacy institution, to civic technologists, for example, please do so. And the answers to these questions will be the things that our panelists will again respond to. I know there are a lot of challenges that have been presented by Pyrou, by Ivy, and also by Phet in the previous discussion. But this next question, or this next part of the discussion, is now looking into what can be done. So I know, for example, that Phet looked into power analysis and power dynamics as part of that process. Ivy talking about the political astuteness to actually not have open data as an entry point for interventions, but something which is actually aligned to governmental priorities. Pyrou was talking about processes of not data extraction, but rather data empowerment. So I would like to invite everyone to, again, go to menti.com and use the code 196154140 and answer the question, what do you think should be done to strengthen openness and open data practices in the region? So we have 2 answers for now, and then we'll take a look at what we have in a bit. Okay, we already have, I think, 4 answers for now. So let's take a look. We have to foster civic tech. To foster civic tech for CLMV, which I think stands for Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken. Then couch the value of opening data to data owners in terms that focus on the positive outcomes, opening data with a purpose. Next is about to build the movement towards key strategic priorities where openness can add value. I think this is something related to what Ivy has mentioned a while ago about political astuteness. We have hold governments to account where they don't meet their open data commitments. I think this is something much more related to all the work of open government partnership. We should have concrete actions and concrete evidence to show what added values for open data are to encourage stakeholders to participate and show how they benefit, which I think alludes to what Hilani has mentioned about the drought of evidence to show that there's actually the value added for openness into the discussion and how we are actually making lives of people more beneficial. So probably we'll have more answers as we go along. And this time around, I would like to invite our panelists again, and I'd like to start off with Ivy on what do you think are, what's your reaction to these suggestions? At the same time, also, what are your recommendations as well from the perspective of somebody like OGP working with governments towards transparency and accountability agenda? Ivy?
Thanks, Miko. I guess I won't wear my OGP hat first. I'll wear this from my previous hat of someone who used to be in government and had to do this work, and then reflecting on the work that I've been doing with some government civil society. My reaction to the things that have been mentioned here is they resonate with me, especially around couching the value of opening data to data owners. The one thing I would mention here, apart from the importance of building the movement and the importance of political navigation, etc., is the reason why there are certain transparency initiatives that have managed to last across political transitions that I've noticed is that there were certain reformers who were able to kind of secure bits and pieces of the work and were able to create incentives within the bureaucracy and use the language of the bureaucracy to kind of protect the work that they've done around fiscal transparency, for example, in the Philippines. So the reformers themselves had to be creative while they were working with civil society in not only, aligning it with priorities of the new administration, but also in looking at the current, I guess, ways of working and even the machinery within the bureaucratic arena, to place that within the memoranda, the ways that different agencies and government departments work together. So in a way, embedding it inside the machinery means that there wasn't enough questions around why are we still, having participatory governance metrics? How did that happen even during a time where in an administration where there were attacks around journalists, for example? So really, and this, I think my next point here is around OGP. And that's the reason why in this strategy that we're getting into, the focus is not only providing more support for open government leaders, specifically the intangible skills that they're able to kind of use and learn and are able to generate with a coalition of reformers inside and outside of government, but also kind of remind the importance of going beyond their own offices and, going beyond executive only, national government only, or parliament doing their standalone work. So we're really trying to push the boundaries of, if it's just XYZ ministry, we're not really going to be able to make this a culture. If we want a culture of open government, we will have to find a way to cut across multiple levels and bring them together. And I know that's easier said than done. That's hard. That's hard to change the way they function. So the question around incentives and how to make sure that we provide that environment for them. The other thing I will say, and the last thing I will say is, earlier it was mentioned around importance of evidence and having these stories ready. And that's also the reason why OGP is also kind of going to double down. We're going to double down in this next phase, this next 5 years, on making sure that stories and evidence from different formats for different kinds of people who are in this space, that you're able to access that you're able to use that for your own purposes, that you're able to get that from OGP and even from the community themselves, so that the community doesn't have to wait for us. You just, are able to connect with each other and engage with one another. And you don't have to wait for us to, finish this research, etc. But really have that platform for the community to continue sharing and learning together as it's happening. Sorry, I said so much.
Thanks, Ivy. But just a quick question on that one. I think you made mention about, integrating and embedding open government practice across different agencies. If correct me if I'm wrong, but when OGP started, you were actually working directly with reformers, right? I mean, it could be just like, one department or one agency or, one champion and so on. So in the next strategy of OGP, in terms of embedding open government practices, this will be more about streamlining these across, right? Is that what I'm getting?
Correct. So it's mainstreaming across all levels. And even there's a mention there also of creating a coalition, even a political level, a political coalition of reformers
across agencies.
Across agencies, across even national and local government, parliament.
Yeah.
So that's the big goal.
Okay. Which I agree that you mentioned is difficult. Phet, you are on deep thoughts.
I listening to Ivy, and I totally agree with all her points, especially and it makes me think about how the word mainstreaming has come. It is just, I think, an indicator of maturity of the field. So we could take it that way. And we were debating earlier about the open label. It's actually I think a sign of not irrelevance, but more of a maturity of the field, that it's sort of mainstreamed into that. I take it that way. But at the same time, old questions are coming back, right? The question of evidence, linking outcomes with the opening of data sets and knowing that. But I think we can give ourselves a bit more slack, that we don't need a unified theory of change for that. I think we can really move forward without, again, perhaps maybe that open name, but also without having to rely on fine-grained research to move on certain agendas, at the same time recognizing the diversity of our region. So going forward, I mean, so I totally agree with Ivy, and I put actually the suggestion of the foster civic tech in CMLV, just to kind of make this point about the diversity, because the notion of being situated in Laos right now, the notion of open data is quite foreign, and from 2015, it remains foreign and alien. And I don't think that's a question of people not being versed or into being data subjects or citizens, as we were talking about earlier, this sort of data citizenship. They're very much so here. However, the open paradigm is kind of neither here nor there in that movement, but the need for data-driven innovations on a local front, where the opportunities are there, where platforms haven't taken over yet. In our region, that's CNLV. It was Miramar just about maybe 8 years ago, before things have been disrupted. I remember with Hilani, actually, with Learn Asia's communication policy program there, and the entrepreneurs that we invited were really looking at mobile for development there. I think the infrastructure is here. It's far more, it's of course much better. Bandwidth is, so the cost of entry into civic tech in CNLV is actually lower than it was before, and the opportunities are better than that before. So that's an example, I think, something concrete about strengthening. And if I can raise a point before I maybe not have an opportunity, and maybe a crazy point about open data, I think we have to raise the question of artificial intelligence and that movement that's happening, how that's going to reframe the notion of open. Because even if you look at OpenAI, they're strictly moving to a closed policy. Open is in their name, but they're closing it because of potential harms, right? Perhaps higher, more sophisticated economies. I'm not talking about CNLV countries. I'm talking about East Asia. I'm talking about Singapore, Malaysia, to a degree. This notion of perhaps we might have to swing the other way to close as sort of data sovereignty as a more of a people putting up walls, and generally for in light of the advance and developments in AI, and how much that either open or closed data set is could be used both positively and negatively. And so I leave you with something concrete and something kind of crazy at the same time. Thanks.
Very good points there. And I think somebody was actually mentioning about that as well, right? I mean, like, how do you situate these types of discussions on open data within the larger frame, for example, of what we're seeing now, artificial intelligence and machine learning? Somebody was actually saying that, policy making on open data has actually been hijacked by AI and machine learning, because this is I mean, like, this is the new threat or the new opportunity that's being presented. And what's the role of government in here? And, I mean, very good points there. Pyrou?
I'm just going to follow that thread on AI because I'm participating with the Digital Futures Lab at the moment to look at AI and climate change actions. So looking at that nexus on how artificial intelligence could actually benefit climate change or help to alleviate climate change. And so we're doing a lot of foresight workshopping at the moment with experts across Asia. So that's something to follow and will be upcoming shortly. I want to reflect on what Ivy said about this storytelling and, sharing knowledge. And I think this really falls back on the trust environment and the lack of that trust within Asia in general and the cultural components of that lack of trust. And I say that again, and I want to re-emphasize, because when we talk about evidence, when we talk about, concrete actions and concrete evidence, like it's based on trust. So you can have concrete evidence. You can have spot fire analysis that says there's a fire happening over here. That's concrete, right? But in the age of disinformation and misinformation, who trusts that? And who disqualifies that, right? And so I think it's the lines of what is evidence and what is not evidence, and whose truth is true and whose truth is not, and which truth has more weight than someone else's truth, is really pertinent in these discussions, because we still have very traditional models and values on who has the authority. In Asia, the authoritative data is the government data, and it's legislated. Any use of data outside of government provisions data in some countries, specifically in CLMV countries, is basically against the law. There's a law in Cambodia that says you can't create maps. They'll never enact that law. It's this really stupid law. But it's there in case someone creates something that the government doesn't like, right? And so that authoritative of evidence is really fundamentally based upon values that may not be exactly what we want to promote in certain contexts. So I think to progress that, what Phet mentioned about maybe we do need to close up some spaces is maybe a good approach. And this is what the data sovereignty approach is about. It's creating these safer spaces, right? Where the governing structures are built around communities of trust. And Indigenous communities innately have that trust, and that you have other models proliferating across the globe as well. I'm not so familiar with them, but the idea of having a data trust where collectives contribute data and there's a trusted governing structure there to manage that data and to disclose what is necessary for their benefit and no more. And I think that's what we need to progress towards. And we do need to have practical examples of where this works. And unfortunately, it is complicated, right, to build that trust, even within trusted networks, and to build governing structures that are solid, that can stand up to other challenges and being challenged. So I think we have some work to do in that respect to build those frameworks and to build those models. But we need to break down our value-based approach to open it up to different types of truths and other people's realities, right? It's not just always going to be our reality.
Thanks very much, Pyrou. And you know what? For me, the gauge of a quality discussion is the number of questions that I have at the end of the discussion rather than answers. And I think this discussion today has provided me a lot of opportunities to think about stuff, from Phet's call about, open may not necessarily be something which is desirable, or maybe we're not anymore, that's not anymore the trend, to Pyrou's moving towards an open, how do you call it? an open governance model among trusted individuals and among trusted institutions, which practically means that, you know, you're closing some spaces, as what Phet has mentioned, to others, and you're actually opening that up only to a certain space. Anyway, I'll stop there and provide an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. And I think, I don't want to put you on the spot here, Isad, but I would like to hear from you, either a question or a comment. So Isad is a good friend from Malaysia. And Isad, I would like to know your thoughts here, whether you have questions, comments, anything. Isad, you can unmute, or you don't want to talk for now.
I see him on there twice.
Sorry. Yeah, I think Isad has two. Isad seems to, okay. So I mean, if Isad is not yet ready, anyone who would like to ask our panelists a question, we have like a couple of like 5 minutes or 7 minutes or 8 minutes or so before we end this discussion. If you don't want to ask a question personally, you can also chat your question at our chat box. So anyone who would like to ask questions, please do so. No one seems to be asking questions for now. Joel, do you have a question? Do you have a question, Joel, for our panelists?
Hey, Michael.
Good to see you again.
Yes. Well, actually, it's interesting. You know, I come from, I mean, I immigrated to the US from the Philippines, and that's why I followed developments there. And, you know, like I relate, what we found is we kind of want to stop emphasizing the open part, is what we found works, and couching the value of opening data to terms that the custodians understand, that helps them first. And the side effect of that is it opens the data. It you know, we get the outcome we want by saying, oh, if you do this, it will have an easier time sharing it with other agencies. You'll have an easier time doing your reporting obligations. And by the way, we get the open data too. So it doesn't become as fearful. Or, you know, I think the instinct is to protect, you know, the data. I mean, that's the instinct, especially with the security concerns, hacking concerns and all that, and PII concerns. But, you know, that's one thing we found that works here.
Very good point there, Joel. And I think this is something which is related to IB, what IB has mentioned, right, in a sense. And also what Phet is actually mentioning a while ago about your, you know, what's the value proposition there? And potentially the entry point is not actually about being open, but rather the usefulness of it or the economic value of the data. And then as a consequence, you're actually getting the outcome that you want. That's an exercise in obliquity there. The openness is the result, but then you don't go directly to that openness agenda by actually going to government's doors and say, open the data app, but rather go an oblique route, but still hit the same openness outcome. Good. Anyone else who would like to say a comment or ask our panelists a question? Maya, would you like to say something, or Hailey? No one's answering. No one's asking questions now, or no one's answering. Kizaya, would you like to ask a question? Okay, Phet, go ahead.
Yeah, just a question to you, Michael. Would you find that any of this feedback would you tweak your chapter any at all, or have we just confused things for you?
Oh, no. I think there's really good value in tweaking the chapter, and making the chapter actually respond to the different discussions that we're doing now. And I there are several points that I actually noted down here, and which I think would enrich how the chapter is currently being built up. By the way, Maya is saying that he is not able to unmute. So can we, Maya, if you're not, can you, Fiona, can you help Maya unmute?
Yeah. Yes, I
Okay.
could. Sorry, there was some
Okay.
glitch.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I just, yeah, it's been a really fascinating view to look at a comparative framework across countries. And clearly, there are certain trends and tendencies. But I don't think this kind of work, has happened, in terms of, had enough of a spotlight. So hopefully, there will be a lot to learn from different frameworks. But clearly the vision we get, or the visual we get, like what we think of is happening in Vietnam from the Indian perspective, or like somebody mentioned that Cambodia doesn't actually allow for any right to information. These are not things that are always obvious. So it would be really useful if there was like a table, like a chart, where if you literally checked best practices across different regions, there's a sense of learning from what frameworks have worked better, toward open data. Sorry, that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maya. I think to a large extent, I mean, what I can potentially do, given that question, would be to look at the data of the Global Data Barometer, which, by the way, is actually, can be downloaded. There's rows and rows of data for each country in the region that has been covered. India, China, for example, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. And I think we can extract that data out in terms of actually looking at specifically on what has happened in China's open data policy, for example, what has happened in India's INDISAP, or what has happened, for example, with the Philippines efforts to actually enshrine it within budget circulars, for example, and so on. So I think that would be a good way to do that as well, and there's value to that one. And from the D4D network, the Global Data Barometer results are available. Yeah. Somebody's about to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say the barometer assesses a lot of laws that link to openness, right? So it's a really good resource for that. But I actually encourage everyone when they read that report to read not just the overview summary, but there's a lot of subcontext within the report in each of the categories. And that really, I think when you aggregate the data up, it does look stark, and you can get a glimpse and an overview, but to understand the complexities behind legislation, like what Helani was saying before, is that there is an access to information law, but how often does it actually work? And then Myanmar is not in that assessment, but in Myanmar, you have this trend where legislations are drafted to restrict freedoms and rights, especially in the technology space now since the recent events. And so I think there are nuances into how laws and legislations are actually utilized to benefit and to actually constrain. And I think those nuances are really important to have a look at.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pyrou. I just actually put on the chat box the link to open data. I mean, that's the very resource that I went through in writing the chapter. So if you have the time, it's in CSV, so it's very easy to sift through. It's a nice data set to work around. So yeah, that would be a good resource to do, to examine. I think we don't have so much time towards the end of this. So I would just like to have one-liners from our panelists before I close the session and hand it over to either Keziah or to Amina. So I'll start with a one-liner from Ivy.
I will use an old motto of the movement. Keep it open. Oh, can you still hear me?
Yes, go.
Keep it open because open. Oh God, I'm gonna change the lines. Keep it open because I'm just gonna update it. Keep it open because open is still the way by which we could achieve those outcomes. With the side note that, Pyrou, as Pyrou mentioned, only for specific aspects.
Thanks, Ivy. Phet?
I'm not sure if I have one liner, but I'm glad to have this conversation because I wasn't quite sure if I was revisiting work that I couldn't speak to anymore. But I'm so surprised that the questions raised really linked to my current work around freedom of expression and closure of civic spaces. So I don't think the open data movement can be in isolation. It has to be in relation to all the other data governance work. And I think you already know that, and you're already moving in that direction. So congratulations, and thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Matt. Pyrou?
I don't have a one-liner, but I'm going to leave with this, is that I think we need to create alternatives spaces, and alternative spaces that allow for greater governance and agency strengthening within communities. So I think we need to break down some of the existing status quos in all of the dynamics that we mentioned throughout this discussion. So that's what I want to leave everyone with.
Thank you very much, Pyrou, and thanks also for the three of you for joining in the panel. Just to say very quickly that there's I have an invite here to Phet's organization's Digital Rights Asia Pacific 2023 happening on the 22nd to the 26th of May next month in Chiang Mai. If you'd like to be in Thailand at that point, please join. And I'm plugging that in because we do have a session in that particular conference. It's entitled With Our Open Data, Creating Synergies and Reflections for Moving Forward. This is something which actually carries on the conversation that we have now. And actually, as Hilani has mentioned, really drill down into concrete actions on what the future should hold. So thank you very much, everyone. Maraming salamat. Terima kasih banyak, Kapun Kap. And I'll hand you over now to Amina for final words, if there are.
Thank you, Miko, for that session. I think it was great to hear everybody say they don't have a one-liner, but went ahead and gave a one-liner. So I'll just go ahead and repeat that. I think what I picked up is keep it open. Let's make open data fashionable again. Let's not work in isolation. Open data cannot work in isolation. There's need to be mindful of the shrinking civic spaces and to assess the changing political environment as well, and finding alternative spaces. That's what Pyrou said. It fits in the one-liner description. Thank you everyone for making time. Maybe just to extend an invitation as well for tomorrow's session. We'll be having the Sub-Saharan African team roundtable happening tomorrow, and we'll also have Team Davis closing the session for us and giving up a summary of the global observations. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye, and have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Fernando, how are you?
Hey, how are you doing? What time is it? Oh, it's only 8 a.m.
No, it's not 30 here. It's all right. It's good. It was great. It's a good session. A good session.
Thanks,
Okay,
Mika,
bye-bye.
for holding this.
Bye-bye. See you.
Bye.
See you.